Good morning, Matt. Hi. Thank you for joining the Zurich Salon podcast, episode 2. And you are a prolific writer on many subjects. You have published for many outlets, the Schweizer Monat in Switzerland or Quillette magazine, where you publish lengthy essays which are extremely insightful on many topics. One of the topics you covered in a recent article is this idea, which has been propagated by people like, Jordan Peterson, Ayn Hirsi or Tom Holland, that what one might call the death of God left a God-shaped hole in Western societies, which is now being filled by, poor replacements of religion. And the way you describe them is as the new theists who believe that liberalism cannot fill this God-shaped hole and that some kind of religious revival of some sort is in order. Could you maybe speak about your main criticism of that, or how you see this new theism movement?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's an idea that the concept of new theism was put forward by a journalist named Ed West in an article for The Spectator, and I think the term has been used elsewhere, but it basically describes a phenomenon where the truth or falsehood of Christianity or Judaism or any of the other monotheisms isn't really the issue. The issue is its social utility and its political utility. And the argument is that as Western societies secularize, we're losing this fundamental anchor for our social cohesion and for political cohesion and for all these values that we should try to hold on to. And as that anchor slips away, it's, the vacuum is being filled by radical politics, or it's being filled by conspiracism or any number of less savory phenomena. So that's the fundamental argument, that we need to return to the sort of grounding that's provided by the judeochristian moral and even political framework. But my criticism is just that, first of all, the new theists often don't spell out what this means. I mean, what are they calling for exactly? Are they just trying to fill the pews again? Do they want old-time religion back? Do they want politicians to more explicitly affirm their belief in God, or do they want 10 Commandments in schools? This is something that we just saw in Louisiana in the United States, and that's an obvious violation of the First Amendment. Do they have a problem with the First Amendment? How's this operationalized? So that's something that you don't often get from the new theists. I think they're still a little squeamish about it, especially if they live in the United States, a country that is under the great roof of the First Amendment and that really values religious freedom and pluralism. I just think that the idea that we need God, or we need some conception of God or organized religion to find meaning in our lives and to avoid slipping into conspiracism or toxic tribal politics is kind of insulting, A, and it's not really workable, B. So yeah, that's the basic critique.
Yes. So as far as I understand it, might the insulting bit tie into a Machiavellian worldview, which is what Machiavelli outlined in various works, but also The Prince, as far as I remember, which is that rulers of society are advised by Machiavelli not only to, dispense with love and rather be feared if that is more useful, but also to propagate in society a belief in God, because that makes them more docile or is more useful for political rulership, even though the ruler himself doesn't need to believe in it. Now, I'm not suggesting that you are alleging this, that Peterson and Ayn Hirsi are doing this in a cynical manner, but it did seem to me that they were more focused, not maybe Jordan Peterson, but others, on the utility of it rather than the truth. Do you see the same thing in some way?
Yeah, I sort of do. I don't think that it's like some conscious attempt to pull the wool over people's eyes and run society more effectively. Like I think somebody like Jordan Peterson does have genuine religious feeling. It's really hard to pin down exactly how that feeling manifests or how it makes sense to him. If you ask Jordan Peterson, do you believe in the divinity of Christ? He becomes very cagey, very dodgy all of a sudden. He actually had a conversation with Alex O'Connor, who's kind of a well-known YouTube atheist, And he just asked him directly, like, if we set up a camera outside of the tomb, did Jesus come out after 3 days? Did a man walk out of the tomb? And Peterson just cannot answer that question. He can't answer the basic factual questions that underlie Christianity, and he doesn't want to. And I remember he had another debate over the utility of religion and the truth of religion, and he was asked, so like, what do you believe in miracles? Do you believe that the natural order can be suspended? And Peterson said something like, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God's. That's a miracle. And he's basically saying that this like warrant for the separation of church and state that can be found in the Bible is a miraculous occurrence in just political history, because it has led to so many good things, And that's not an answer. He knew what was being asked of him, and he refused to answer the question. Like, he doesn't want to talk about the suspension of the natural order. He doesn't want to talk about the suspension of the laws of physics or biology or any of that. He wants to have a different conversation, and he's always talking in these sort of grandiose metaphorical terms, and he's never pinning down exactly what. But I think this is just confusion on his part. I don't think Jordan Peterson is this Machiavellian figure who's thinking like we have to feed good old fashioned religion to all the rubes, just to keep them in line. I think he's genuinely confused philosophically about the implications of his form of theism. Whereas somebody like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I think, is much more swayed by the utilitarian argument, but not utilitarian philosophically, but like the utility of having religion as this sort of substrate for society and sort of this foundation for our values. And she worries about wokeness, and she worries about the encroachments of political Islam and all these other issues. So it's interesting, when she wrote that essay in Unheard, I think in November 2023, about how she had become a Christian, she didn't have anything to say about the divinity of Christ. She didn't have anything to say about Christian doctrine. I mean, the entire article was completely political. I mean, it was all about how we have to have religion as a bulwark against wokeness and against these other encroachments that I mentioned. So yeah, I think it just varies from person to person. But no, I don't think it's cynical. But I do think it's misguided.
Okay, well, independently of the motives of these people, as you say, in an age where science is very much in fashion, the idea that the laws of the universe can be suspended by miracles might not be particularly useful. But on the utilitarian point, is there a sense in which you would fundamentally question the utility of Christianity, not only as something that could be revived, but also in the past? I think you have fundamental critiques there, or doubts about the fundamental position that it is useful and good
absolutely.
for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's so. This is a problem I have with other new theists like Tom Holland, who wrote a book called Dominion, and it was about how Christianity basically swept the world and just became the dominant force in politics in Europe, and then spread around the world. He basically argues that every good thing we have is a product of Christian thought. Every good thing we have, including secularism. And I always think you're stacking the deck if you're going to make this argument, Like to say that the Enlightenment critiques of religion are fundamentally religious is just this circular argument that you can never escape from, I mean, if humanity ends up becoming an interplanetary species and Elon Musk gets his wish, and then we have AI that supersedes us in every way, will the values instantiated in AI, a trillion years from now, will they still be products of religion? At what point can you say, okay, we have taken on board some good things that religion gave us, and I do think religion was important in the construction of early states and the construction of a conception of the rule of law. I think there's some evidence that states and civilizations that didn't have a transcendental religion like Christianity struggled to develop the same institutions that we have in the West. I mean, China is like the prime example. So I'm willing to cede that ground to the theists. But at the same time, I'm also willing to argue that the Enlightenment critiques of religion leveled by Hume and others were absolutely essential in the development of ideas behind like the First Amendment in the United States and behind secular institutions that we have. So it's this interplay. But it's just saying that religion gave us everything we have, and then just repeating that over and over again, it just seems to me an unfair way to argue and an unfair way to stack the deck. So.
Yes, yes. They don't simply talk about religion, they specifically talk about the judeochristian heritage we have, which is a very specific historical phenomenon. And one might go back to Greece, to the ancient Athenians, which occurred before Christianity was even thought of, and was quite independent of Jews and the Jewish religion, which was going on at that time even. But they seemed to have quite a stable political system. Democracy comes out of there. So one might, and their politics was quite divorced from religion, quite remarkably. And so democracy is one example, and equality of speech, which preceded the Judeo-Christian ideas. In fact, the Greek conception fed into that. But what another point might be Plato, which is quite an obvious point, where the idea of the highest good, which is what Peterson always touts as the fundamental Christian or religious belief, was already instantiated. So I share your doubts. But one could point to the Crusades, which is what you do, and the Inquisition, Spanish or otherwise, and so on.
Not unfairly.
And the religious wars. And we know this, all right? So if we look at history, one might say that based on Christianity's record, it has demonstrably failed, and that the Enlightenment really gave us the liberalism that replaced that, which runs along atheistic and scientific lines, and that kind of worldview. However, do you actually think that liberalism, as it currently stands, is capable of providing that? Well, we all see it. I think we're agreed that there is some sort of lack in modern society. They call it a God-shaped hole. We might call it like that. Maybe that's making the past way too rosy. But there is some kind of problem here, which religion might have been able to fill in the past, and religion might not be the solution. But is there a problem with liberalism right now, or whatever is filling that gap right now?
There might be. Well, first to build on something you said, it is just worth remembering, the long litany of horrors that religion has given us. I mean, it's like the Enlightenment was in many ways a response to centuries of religious bloodletting. I think the wars of religion in Central Europe killed something like a third of the population if you count, all the poverty and the starvation and the disease that came along with war. So it's just like, again, like people were horrified by this, and they thought we should move away from these dogmas, and they consciously did so, and they consciously, like the Enlightenment was in large part a criticism of the dogmas that had caused things like the 30 Years' War. So anyway, I'm glad you mentioned that, and don't have to harp on it, but yeah, not exactly a marginal issue. There's a book called Liberalism as a Way of Life, and it's I sort of reviewed it in my Quillette article about this crisis of meaning concept, and I appreciated what the author was trying to do with the book, but I thought it was a failure, because I thought he was just trying to turn religion into a sort of modern religion, or liberalism into a modern religion. And I don't think that's necessary. I don't think we need a modern religion. I'm just not sure if I buy the premise of the argument that we're going through some crisis of meaning. What's the evidence that's usually marshaled for this claim? Usually people will bring up the profusion of identity politics. They'll bring up wokeness. They'll bring up political tribalism. They'll say that it's gotten worse, all these things. I mean, these are all phenomena that I've written about. They're things that I care about, but I'm not sure that it means that people in their interpersonal lives have found, this spiritual hollowness or emptiness. Like, does it mean that we value our relationships with family members less? Does it mean we value our relationships with our friends less? Like, we derive less meaning out of work? I mean, what is the crisis of meaning? I mean, whenever you actually try to pin people down on the phenomena they're actually concerned about here, you usually get this long list of complaints. I mean, Ayaan Hirsi Ali will talk about, the fact that kids seem to be getting propagandized at universities, and they seem to care about the wrong things, the color of their colleagues' and classmates' skin, and genitalia and that sort of thing. Like, and it seems this seems like a very weak, vacuous critique. This is supposed to be evidence that we're going through a crisis of meaning, like on a global scale, and then when the answer to the crisis of meaning is a return to theism. When Tom Holland says, like, these secular societies better get on board and recognize that societies like Turkey, for example, or India, and in India, Modi is trying to build a Hindu nationalist state. In Turkey, Erdogan is very cynically bringing back political Islam. And he says, look at these societies. They're the wave of the future. They have a grounding that we don't have in the West. I just wonder if he's serious. Is he really arguing that there is greater social cohesion in India than there is in say, Denmark or the United States? I'm not sure that that's true. That seems like a very dubious claim. Is he saying that Erdogan's cynical, appropriation of Islamic concepts in politics, modern politics, is a way forward for that society? And it's also interesting that, the most powerful country in the world outside of the United States is China, which is run by the godless CCP. That didn't seem to factor into Holland's assertion that the wave of the future is new theism. So there's so many questions that I have about this idea, and they're not being answered by the people who are putting it forward. So yeah, basically, I don't think there's a crisis of meaning in Western societies. I can speak for myself. I derive a lot of meaning out of my work and my relationships, And that's another element of what I meant when I said it's insulting. It's insulting to tell me that my life is devoid of meaning because I don't subscribe to these myths or I don't go to church regularly,
I understand that. But to push back against it, perhaps phrasing it in a different way. Because if we get away from the framing of the new theists, we might observe that there is a certain atomization which has happened in society, where religious membership has gone down, but also the trade unions have declined, and people are becoming increasingly depoliticized in a certain sense. For instance, I'll say that most people don't really care about politics anymore, which might be connected to liberalism, because if liberalism is supposed to have replaced religion, liberalism has a highly political edge to it, which religion does not. And in a certain sense, what Ayn Hirsi is doing is maybe conflating two things. She is identifying, as you say, a political problem, which is all the wokery going on and so on, with a religious kind of yearning in people. So the religious thing will not solve the political problem she is actually concerned with. So she might be proposing the wrong remedy for an illness which is of a different kind. However, on the atomization point, I would also say that there is a problem in Western societies one might also identify, and it's not just capitalism, which is, maybe made consumerist culture and commodified everything, something which we might be concerned about. There is also a lack of shared values in Western society, which goes back to maybe what you might call a postmodernism, the linguistic turn, and all these theories which have sprung up criticizing meta-narratives, which have made people very reticent about making judgments about right or wrong in a factual sense or good and bad in a moral sense. So if you, for example, if someone stands up and says Western civilization is superior to, a certain Chinese attitude which has no problem with no democracy and no freedom of speech, you will get cancelled. Because who are you to say that this society or these values that come out of this society are better than any other, even if you say it's historically specific and not essentialist in its nature, the claim that you're making? Don't you see that that might be another way of phrasing the same problem, but more political or more in the Enlightenment sense, that making judgments about moral systems and thoughts and actions is a good thing, to exercise your judgment, as Kant said?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say that people are less political. I mean, certainly in the United States, this is one of the problems that's actually identified by the new theists, is that you're correct, voluntary associations are down. This is the whole bowling alone concept, which has really taken hold, I think, in the American imagination. I think we sort of know that with the decline of organized religion, with the decline of other voluntary associations. This is what, Tocqueville thought was the wonderful thing about America, was that people would just form committees about, building new fences in town and like addressing problems in small communities. And that's a form of direct democracy. It's a form of engagement there's a lot of psychological literature that suggests that when you engage with people, you're just happier. I mean, even talking to somebody at the store, who's bagging your groceries will make you a happier person. And that stuff is down, and that's a problem, definitely. I do not think the answer is to return to Judeo-Christian beliefs or values, but that's just the first point. I just wanted to set that aside. And in the United States, we have forged identities around political parties. I mean, your support of Trump or your opposition to Trump has much more of more of an identity-based valence now than it used to. Like, people care about politics; they really do. So you'll have to explain to me what you mean when you say it seems like people aren't as interested in politics as they once were. So that's that's a question that we can table for now. But yeah, I just think that the idea that Western secular societies are. Can you remind me what's the core question outside of the idea that we're sort of getting away from politics and voluntary association? Like, what was the second half of your?
Well, I was trying to say that there is a certain atomization happening, and perhaps it has to do with the climate of cancel culture and censorship, which is not just a trivial point, because it links back to the idea that fundamentally making moral judgments about people, which requires discussion and interaction with other people in a free market of ideas, to put it crudely, is on the decline and has been for many a decade.
Okay, yeah, sure. So one thing I was thinking when you were making that point about how, if you say Western society is in some sense better, if you make a value judgment about Western society versus, I don't know, Chinese society, or at the very least the Chinese system or something like that, then you could get canceled. Well, I don't think you would get canceled. I mean, Francis Fukuyama essentially makes the argument that liberal democracy it's a better system over the long run. It will secure human flourishing and economic growth and everything that we value more effectively than one-party dictatorship. So you can make a value judgment, and that's fine. And I can point out that when Modi is marginalizing Muslims in India, who comprise a large proportion of India's population, that this is disastrous and that it will lead to stratification and social problems. You can make value judgments without having to worry about being canceled. I do think that it's probably true that our societies are a little bit more atomized than they once were, but this seems like a fixable problem to me. If you mentioned union membership, and Biden has been one of the most pro-union presidents we've had in office in many decades. And you can either support that or not support it as a matter of politics. But it seems to me like it's a pendulum that can swing in the other direction. I mean, there was definitely a very strong push over the past couple of years among Amazon workers, among Starbucks workers, among a lot of different employees in different industries in the United States to unionize. And maybe this is something that can pick back up. These are trends that can ebb and flow. But and I don't think we're just condemned to an eternity of greater and greater atomization. I mean, sometimes. The fact that we're having this conversation about new theism and about the crisis of meaning could indicate that people are aware of it, and it could lead to some creative thinking about how we can forge new voluntary associations. There are some interesting political alliances that have been brought about by Trumpism. I write for The Bulwark, which is an outlet that was founded by Bill Kristol and several other right-wing figures who would have been absolute anathema to the left, just 10, 15 years ago. They would have been viewed as the just warmongering neocon elite, but now there are a lot of people on the left who come to the Bulwark and say, yeah, this is the sort of politics that we need. I mean, this is the coalition we need to defeat Trump. And this sort of thing can happen. And the Bulwark has built a pretty impressive political community. They have a lot of events around the country. And I just think people, when we're faced with such a clear and present danger like Trumpism, interesting things can happen. Like there can be a silver lining, people can set aside certain disagreements and agree like, well, I mean, one thing we will defend is the Constitution, and one thing we will defend is the peaceful transfer of power, and all of these things that were once taken for granted but can't be taken for granted anymore, And I think that there's possibility in that, there's the possibility of more organizations that are focused on these like fundamental American values, American in my case, but liberal values more broadly. So anyway, I'm just not that pessimistic about it. I don't know. I mean, I'm really horrified by some political developments, and I don't like identity politics and certain aspects of what's called wokeism. But again, the answer is not to return to religious dogma. Like it's just, I never think that's the answer. So.
Yes, I agree with you. I also agree with you that on the religious dogma that is not to be returned to in order to solve things now. But still, certain things do need solving. I mean, I agree with you that it's not hopeless for the organizations to come back roaring into some sort of, glorious state of mass membership. But
just a profusion of bowling leagues.
Yeah, a profusion of little platoons, as Burke
millions
called
of
them.
New bowlers.
Exactly. And but I do think that since you asked, the depoliticization, America may be a special case right now. But if you look at other Western societies, particularly in Europe, more and more people are not voting. For example, the recent election of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in Britain, a lot of people just didn't vote. And none of the above is more and more popular as a choice in elections, and even referenda in Switzerland. So there does seem to be some sort of wide disaffection with politics, a disillusionment that has happened, which might be said to, be reducible to the fact that no matter who you vote for, the policies don't change. They stay the same. Two cheeks of the same backside, as some call them. Republicans, Democrats, Labour, Conservative, left versus right.
But do you really think that? I mean, in the United States, we have very, very real, very fundamental disagreements about the future of the country. Now, I mean, we have a president who wants to pull the United States out of NATO. We have a president who wants the states to make decisions about women's reproductive health, and like that means he's saddled with the worst bills. The 6-week heartbeat bills in Idaho and other places like that. I mean, these are vast differences. So I guess I'm just pushing back. Do you think that it's true that it's just like two heads of the same coin? Like it seems to me that there are just real, even more fundamental differences between the parties in the U.S. than there were 15 years ago.
Well, I do admit that America may be a special case right now, but I don't think it really disproves my point. Maybe it even strengthens it, because what I'm trying to point to is that something that has been here since the French Revolution, this difference between right and left, is no longer a useful concept. In fact, it's detrimental, because these oppositions, which were once stark, are now less pronounced. It is more the narcissism of small differences than really fundamentally opposing worldviews. And I think in Europe you really see that. But I think Trump may be an instance of where this old framework, which is no longer useful and is now more or less defunct, is starting to break apart. For instance, I mean, these new coalitions you speak about, Tulsi Gabbard, a Democrat, is supporting Trump. Trump was a lifelong Democrat. Then you have Elon Musk, who was also a Democrat, supporting Trump. Now, I don't want to reduce it to that, but there does seem to be a sense in which, for instance, the Republicans are more and more speaking to working class people, whereas it should be the Democrats who traditionally speak for, as a party of the left, in modern times, speaks for working class people, whereas the Democratic Party, is now becoming something more of an elite thing. Same thing with the Labour Party in Britain, but also around Europe. Left parties are increasingly being supported by people in the cities, people who work on their laptops, people who have degrees, people who are more middle class, whereas the right-wing populist parties are being supported by people who usually don't support the right historically, which is the working classes. So there does seem to be some kind of shift going on where the world is being flipped on its head.
Yeah, well, first of all, it is a claim that's often made. It's made in American media that Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr. are somehow evidence that Trump is building like a bipartisan coalition because they used to be Democrats. I mean, these people are Democrats in name. maybe. And they were Democrats in name. There's nothing about Tulsi or RFK Jr. that represents anything like the mainstream of the Democratic Party. Tulsi Gabbard is an apologist for atrocity in Syria, and she's an apologist for Assad. She said the United States should work with Russia, to pulverize Syrian civilians in the name of stability. So yeah, there's really nothing about her that represents anything like the main currents of the Democratic Party, thank God. And RFK Jr. I mean, where do you even begin? I know you didn't bring him up, but I bring both of them up because they're both now major surrogates for Trump, and he's using them, and a lot of his supporters use them as sort of evidence that he's bipartisan and he's reaching across the aisle, and it's just laughable. I mean, RFK is a lunatic. I mean, the guy thinks that he thinks that the COVID lockdowns are worse than the Holocaust. I mean, he says he thinks 5G is this like government surveillance operation. So anyway, that's just to round out that little aside. But I do think you're actually right that the political dynamics have shifted for sure. I mean, what you say about the working class moving over to Trump, that's just a fact. There are a lot of Obama voters who voted for Trump. And this is a phenomenon that the Democratic Party absolutely has to grapple with. And here's the thing. I think they are grappling with it. I mean, Kamala Harris in 2019 is just not Kamala Harris in 2024. I mean, she obviously moved to the left because the party kind of had this fit of progressivism in 2019 during the primary, and pretty much everybody, if they wanted to compete, had to move left. That was cynical on her part. And if that's a knock against her, then sure. Or if you want to say it's a knock against her, then 100%. But it seems to me that she's really tacked back to the center, and she's really trying to talk about these in the last couple of weeks, especially. She's trying to talk about the threat Trump poses to democracy. She's reminding Americans that this is a guy whose relationship with Vladimir Putin is sort of terrifying. Apparently, he talked to him 7 times in his post-presidency, and this is according to reporting from Bob Woodward. He's somebody who wants to give away the game in Ukraine immediately. I mean, he says the first thing he's going to do is call up Putin and say, I'll end the war in 24 hours. Well, how do you end the war in 24 hours? And you do it by handing Putin every last, acre of land he's stolen. And then you probably offer some kind of assurance like Ukraine will never join NATO. So you're expressing the same contempt for Ukrainian sovereignty that Putin expresses. So this is Trump's view. But yeah, on issues like trade, it's true that Trump, he probably represents the consensus among the working class in the United States more effectively than previous administrations. I mean, this is why people liked what he said about TPP. People don't like the thought of jobs being shipped overseas, and his tariffs on China have remained in place. This is a point Trump made during the debate. It was a perfectly fair point. He said you could have taken my tariffs off at any time, but it's politically. I think the Biden administration recognizes that it would be politically problematic to remove the tariffs. And maybe it's a form of leverage that we can use with China. Across the board, 20% tariffs, which is what Trump is now calling for, and then he's calling for 60% tariffs on China and maybe as high as 200% on Mexican vehicles. And this is the sort of thing that is just this is just cartoonish. I mean, it's economically insane. It will not do anything good for anybody, including the working class. It's not going to lead to a manufacturing renaissance. It's going to drive prices up for consumers. But this is another policy difference that's massive. But where you're right is that I do think that these winds have shifted a little bit. The working class has absolutely migrated toward the Republican Party. Democrats can't just sit around and hope that the demographics will be in their favor until the end of time. That's a huge political mistake. And I think there's also a huge divide over authoritarianism. I think there's in the United States, we're debating more fundamental issues than we used to. There's a pro-authoritarian and an anti-authoritarian electorate, and that's scary. And that's why Trump has to lose in November.
Yes, I understand. We'll get to Trump and versus Harris.
No,
we'll get there.
We're recording this in late October.
Indeed. But speaking of October, one thing which has galvanized American foreign policy and the entire woke class as well, and has been a political issue where, let's say, moral judgments have reared their head again, is Israel, where on the 7th of October, Hamas infiltrated it and killed hundreds upon hundreds of people, civilians. You wrote an article which said that, you were talking about John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, 2 professors in America from Harvard and Stanford, I believe.
University of Chicago.
Yes. University of Chicago and Harvard. And they make the case that it is not a interest of the United States from a realistic perspective which seeks to secure national interest to support Israel. The decline of the Cold War, or the end of it, really made that support of the US for Israel superfluous. But nonetheless, it seems that many people now believe that the US should support Israel more and more. Of course, there is the opposite movement, and this is a huge battle with the university protests and more, that Israel is a genocidal state. So maybe tell us first how you stand on the entire Israel question. Are they committing genocide or not? And then we'll get on to the realist position and your critique of it.
Yeah, no, I don't believe they're committing genocide. It's that you know, people will use words like apartheid, and it's a very loaded word, and you could make an argument for that, I suppose, but that sort of implies, you know, that discounts the fact that there is a very large Arab population in Israel itself, you know, and people can vote, and they have the same rights as anyone else, with a few exceptions because it is a religious state. But anyway, the idea that they're committing genocide is insane, because Israel could muster its full force and just wipe out Gaza tomorrow if it wanted to, you know, and we know what they would do if they had the power to do that, because they're doing it right now. Like, they're not wiping out Gaza. I mean, if you gave Hamas nuclear weapons, if you gave Hamas Israel's arsenal, Israel would actually be gone tomorrow. I mean, we would see a massacre on a scale that's, you know, mid 20th century. Like, it would be truly horrifying. So that's a distinction you should always bear in mind. You know, if it's a genocide, they've done the worst job trying to commit genocide over the past few decades that anyone's ever done. So the basic argument that Walt and Mearsheimer make, and these are realists in the academic sense, so they subscribe to a theory of international relations called realism, and realism basically holds that, you know, the international system is anarchic. So what really matters is the distribution of power in that system. And what the United States has to do is make sure that power is distributed in such a way that it secures our interests and that it secures global stability. So they think that the United States supports Israel, or offers far too much support to Israel. They claim that they're pro-Israel because, you know, they think the United States should step in and prevent the total obliteration of Israel, if that were ever something that was on the table, which I've always thought is just laughable. I mean, what kind of ally would you be if you said, we'll step in, and how do you know? How do you know when they're just perched on the edge of obliteration? You know, it's kind of hard to know. And how much death and destruction precedes that point. So that's the first thing. It's not operationalizable. But they would also say the same thing about any other state. They don't think any state should be destroyed. You know, they want the United States to be what they call an offshore balancer, which means, you know, like during the Iran-Iraq War, realists thought that it was wise to support Saddam Hussein. You know, you don't want Iran to become a regional hegemon, so you support Iran's enemy, which is Iraq. That means supporting Saddam Hussein while he's committing genocide against the Kurds, committing massive human rights violations, and so on. So I think that realism as a theory can really shade into something quite sinister. In the case of Israel, they think that there was a case to be made for supporting Israel by realist lights during the Cold War, because Israel fought several wars with neighboring Arab states. These states were funded and supported by Russia, and Israel just kept winning those wars. And this was a black eye for Russia, and it forced them to siphon resources into the region. And Israel was just really pulling its weight. So that's what they think. And then when the Cold War ended and the United States was no longer competing with the Soviet Union in the Middle East, they thought the rationale for defending Israel evaporated. And we should just start treating Israel like a completely normal state. But they think there's something called the Israel Lobby, which is this diffuse group of organizations and newspapers, and it's actually so vast that it encompasses millions of people.
Even people who write letters to the New York Times.
Exactly. If you write a letter to the editor at the Hartford Courant or something, you know, then you're a part of the Israel Lobby. You know. So my article in Quillette.
It's an easy organization to join.
Right there. I mean, I'm a part of the Israel Lobby. You know, I wrote the piece. So they think that the Israel Lobby has pulled the wool over Americans' eyes and convinced them that they have to keep supporting Israel for moral and strategic reasons, when those moral and strategic reasons are non-existent.
In their view.
In their view, yeah. So that's their core argument. The first problem with that is that Americans genuinely support Israel. We were talking about this before we started rolling, but one of the most damning aspects of the book is that they cannot account for the initial rise of the Israel lobby, what they call the Israel lobby. There was a point when JFK was talking to Golda Meir, and he said that the United States relationship with Israel is special. It's a special relationship in the same way that we have a special relationship with Great Britain. And then the United States started supporting Israel militarily in the mid-'60s. And then this support really ramped up after the 6-Day War and then after the Yom Kippur War. And so it kept ramping up. The question is, why was Israel special then? Had the Israel lobby been working away on JFK? There was no lobby to speak of at that point. AIPAC was a small organization, but Americans have this genuine connection to Israel because it's a besieged democracy in the Middle East. There are a lot of American Jews. I think the largest population of Jews outside of Israel in the world, I think, is New York. So there are good reasons why Americans support Israel. There's nothing sinister about this. I ended the piece by saying this is just politics, there's a network of pro-Israel organizations. It is a powerful, and they are powerful in Washington, but they are powerful because they have been given power by the American people and by donations and, everything else. So, and then, their actual arguments that Israel is militarily and strategically and then morally unworthy of our support, I think are very bad, which we can get into. I mean, I can explain why I think morally there are good reasons to support Israel. But anyway, I feel like I've been talking for a while, and that's the basic argument.
No, but it is interesting that these realists think that there is no utilitarian, pragmatic case for the US to support Israel at this point or up until recently, since after the end of the Cold War. And then they think that the Israel lobby has convinced people to support Israel nonetheless, based on historical and moral arguments, which these realists think to be very weak. So I don't think we actually have to discuss much why the moral and historical arguments are very strong, because I think we can just point to the Holocaust, the anti-Semitism, the fact of the Yom Kippur War and the 6-Day War, and so on, and the fact, that Israel is a democracy, which is what America's foreign policy is, as you say in your piece, which is a history of strengthening democracies around the world, with that as its aim. I think you'd agree there, wouldn't you? These are quite fundamental issues. I think people who've been to the Salon will know about that, but do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that the moral arguments for supporting Israel. I mean, a lot of Americans are uncomfortable about how the war in Gaza has been waged. There are people who think like that's a lot of civilian casualties. Biden has pressured Netanyahu to ease up. He said, "Don't go into Rafah." Netanyahu said, "I'm going into Rafah." Like our leverage over Israel has been sort of exposed as weaker than people may have thought. So it's perfectly fine to be horrified by the civilian toll in Gaza, and the status quo in Israel and Palestine is unsustainable. This is why a two-state solution has been American policy for a very long time. But what Walt and Mearsheimer do is they endlessly stack the deck against Israel, and they say that when Arab leaders talk about completely expropriating and destroying the state of Israel, they're not really serious. And you should take what they say with a grain of salt, and like they just repeatedly said this in the book, and I just think that's ludicrous, because anytime any Israeli lawmaker says something that sounds xenophobic or aggressive, then they'll say, well, this is evidence of something akin to ethnic cleansing, or it's just such a slanted argument, and then they're not confronting the difficult reality that Israel faces. And this is a point that has been brought up by countless people. If there was a force in Mexico and northern Mexico lobbing missiles at the United States, believe me, that would not last for long. No state can tolerate that. It doesn't matter what you think about the founding of Israel. The state exists now. The state will exist in perpetuity. So the United States should continue to support Israel. I mean, yeah, we should attempt to exert influence when we think they're going too far. For example, I don't think the Netanyahu government has a very good end game in mind for Gaza, and they can never actually explain what that end game is. We should push them on that. That's perfectly fine. But the Israelis push themselves on that more than American media outlets do. I mean, really, you'll see more hard questions asked by Haaretz reporters than you're going to see from anyone in the United States, because it's a vibrant democracy. But anyway, yeah. So I agree with you though that we probably don't need to spend too much time rehearsing the moral and strategic arguments. But yeah, they're strong.
Yes, but a question that has come to mind for me is, if you want to be a realist and you argue that states are very pragmatic and pursue their own self-interest, the idea which Mearsheimer, espouses, that Israel is trying to commit genocide in Gaza. Why? What is actually how does a realist explain that Israel would want to commit genocide? That would seem to me the most counterproductive means of achieving any end that a state might have. It seems to, if they were really committing genocide, it would destroy. They're not. I don't believe Israel is committing genocide. That's a nonsense argument for me. But if they were, as Mearsheimer claims, that would be most irrational. It would destroy Israel in the eyes of the international community. It would make them a pariah state. It would not satisfy any legitimate interest they might have. Because if we're thinking about states' rational interests, then an interest like that would have to be legitimate. Because I think that a bad aim for a state can only be bad for it in consequence, as a utilitarian kind of calculation. So do you see the same problem now? That he's contradicting himself there, because whereas he sees all states as being rational actors, Israel uniquely is a completely irrational actor, demonic almost.
Yeah, it depends on, because I think he kind of has this 19th century view of state behavior where he actually had a debate with Steven Pinker about moral progress. He thinks it's illusory, essentially. I mean, Mearsheimer thinks moral and political progress essentially don't happen over time. Wow. So, yeah, he sort of thinks that states have always done this. They've always moved into other territories and dominated those territories and kicked out the inhabitants. I mean, the United States certainly did it when the United States was founded. I think Mearsheimer just thinks that that's just how states continue to behave. So, yeah, I think it's easy for him to convince himself that Israel's committing ethnic cleansing in Gaza. It's interesting because he refuses to acknowledge that Putin is doing that. He refuses to acknowledge that Putin is an imperialist. He had a debate. It was one of the most flabbergasting things I've ever seen. A couple months after the invasion, we have a lot of evidence about Putin's thought process. I mean, he wrote this ridiculous essay in 2021 called "On the Historical Unity of Ukrainians and Russians." He has pure, obvious imperial intent. He just wants to absorb as much of Ukraine as possible. I mean, Russia went for Kyiv. People forget this. They went for Kyiv and they got repelled. They would have taken over the whole country. They had parade uniforms in their kit. They were ready to march through the streets of Kyiv. And Mearsheimer just says there's no evidence. There's no evidence that Putin is an imperialist. He said this in the debate. He's said it every single time he's ever been asked. He's never admitted that Vladimir Putin is an imperialist. So somehow Putin's intentions are just rational. He's just resisting NATO encroachment on Russia. He's just doing what he believes is in the best interest of the Russian people. Whereas Israel is committing ethnic cleansing and doing these horrible things. It's just, there's something extremely fishy about the way Mearsheimer argues. And he's actually been much worse than Walt in recent years, in my opinion. Walt kind of sticks more to his guns and sticks to the basic realist arguments. Whereas, Mearsheimer goes and meets with Orban and talks about, that they had a very productive discussion about Russia, of course, because Orban's the most pro-Putin leader in the entire EU. So it's just, it's really alarming that this guy has as much influence as he has, and he puts an academic and a legitimate sort of mainstream gloss on pretty ugly ideas. If you're going to take that view of Israel and then that view of Putin, you put those two together and you've got something consistent happening, which is just sort of anti-Western, anti-American, anti-liberal democracy. So who knows what's going on in the guy's head.
Indeed. I think you drew out the contradictions in Mearsheimer's position very well, and the weakness of it as well. But let me ask you if we can come on to the election in America, which is coming up, because this will also have an influence on let's say, Israel policy, do you think that Mearsheimer's position is, well, I would say it's far more represented as a thing people believe in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party? Also, I think perhaps one might say that if Kamala Harris wins, that will not be good for Israel. Will you share this concern?
No, not really. I mean, I actually think that Biden's been, one of the first things he did after October 7th was he rushed to Israel and, reaffirmed American support and gave Bibi a big hug. So, I don't think, there's a reason why the left in the United States, I think the left that you really don't like, the more woke left, the sort of university activists, they hate Biden on Israel. Hate him. Call him Genocide Joe. I mean, there was a protest vote in Michigan, during the primary season, where people would write in somebody else, that wouldn't vote for Biden just to demonstrate their opposition. There are a lot of people who consider themselves, I guess pro-Palestinian, for lack of a better term, in the United States, who think Biden is far too pro-Israel, and there's no indication that Kamala will deviate from Biden on the subject. She's been a little bit more forceful about how human rights matter and we need to bring the conflict to an end, but not really, and I just think the mainstream Democratic Party pro-Israel. I don't think we have anything to worry about. I don't think a Democrat would have lobbied to move the capital to Jerusalem like Trump did or done. I mean, Trump sort of does these cartoonishly over the top gestures, and he presents himself as just the most implacable pro-Israel person. But he also says some very alarming, very creepy things about how, if he loses, it's probably going to be the Jews' fault, not enough support from the Jews. Like, they don't appreciate what he's done for him. He says things like this, and they're very, very weird. He says, I want Jews to manage my money. This is ugly. It's kind of funny that the people who are so worried about anti-Semitism on the left very frequently look at Trump and see nothing wrong. I mean, I don't know. I don't think he's an anti-Semite, but I think that he does traffic in some pretty ugly stereotypes. I think every time he says, George Soros is a globalist and we know what he's up to. Like, there's something ugly about it. It's I just don't want to throw the accusation around willy-nilly, but we know that that's a component of right-wing, populist right-wing discourse, and there is sort of a disproportionate concern over, like people like Soros, and Soros, he's had bomb threats and he's had a lot of really horrifying run-ins in the United States. So anyway, I leave that for you to consider.
On the other hand, Soros is a billionaire, and one might question what a billionaire is up to if he's getting involved in politics. The same way one might question Musk. The only difference being that if one criticizes Soros, one can be readily accused of anti-Semitism, even if
I really don't want to just throw that around. If you want to criticize,
I get that. I get
that. That would be sort of that would be irresponsible. But I just think Trump has done enough, and to sort of single out American Jews and say, what the hell do they think, and like, look at all I've done for them. There's something very odd about that. I mean, it's something you would certainly never see happen in any other political context. I mean, can you imagine if Kamala Harris said, because a lot of black men are not supporting her. She just has less of the African American vote than Biden did, and than the Democratic Party has had historically. And can you imagine if Kamala Harris, after all I've done for them, said acted like she was entitled to their votes. I mean, this is like politics 101. You don't act like you're entitled to people's votes.
No, but the Democratic Party seems to do that. But before we get to that, I mean, and the black vote, which is the entitlement issue, and then Trump, is there not a problem on the left with anti-Semitism? I mean, if you look at the kind of protests that have happened, those people are not on the right, they tend to be on the left. Of course, there have been right-wing protests against Israel, probably, and so on. And, right-wing ultra-nationalist neo-Nazis hate Israel, I do suppose. But, well, the left, and you know who I'm speaking of, who cannot condemn Hamas, who think Palestinians, Hamas, they're blameless completely, and Israel is to blame for everything. And that the only escalating party in the conflict is Israel, and that Hamas never escalated. Same thing with Hezbollah and so on. And they might even have no problem with Iran. It does seem to me that their singular focus on Israel and their hatred of it does denote some sort of antipathy towards Jews in particular, because they do not show the same disgust towards countries like China or, well, I think that will suffice as an example.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. No, there is a problem of anti-Semitism on the left. That's something I can readily admit. On the left, the broader left, I do not think the institutional Democratic Party has an anti-Semitism problem. This is not, Corbyn's Labour Party, which had a institutional anti-Semitism problem, which had a demonstrable anti-Semitism problem. So, yeah, I mean, but you're absolutely right. I mean, some of the protests on campus have been horrifying. I mean, Jewish students have actually been chased into dorms. I mean, the awful things have happened in the United States on this front. There are, I think the Chicago chapter of Black Lives Matter just posted a picture on Instagram of a paraglider, and right after October 7th. This is not a bomb has fallen from Israel at this point. And they're saying, we support the liberation struggle. And the picture of a paraglider, which is like this graphic that they had done up, the night before. I mean, this is obviously just utterly revolting and clearly anti-Semitic, and you see that fairly frequently. I mean, especially on the hard left in the United States, yeah. And you'll see a lot of people who just say Hamas is a legitimate resistance movement, they have every right to resist by force of arms, as if that's the only thing in question, as if Hamas will even say that it was a military attack. I mean, it was an attack on a music festival. It was an attack on peaceful kibbutzes with a lot of pro-Palestinian Israelis who were killed. I mean, we do not need to go through the horrors of October 7th, but they were absolutely mind-boggling. So yeah, the fact that this even exists in the United States is very alarming, and I completely agree with you. And to the extent that if there was any sort of infiltration of that kind of thinking into the institutional Democratic Party, it would really alarm me. But I'm not sure that I see it. You've seen some ugly comments from members of the Squad, for example, a very progressive group in Congress. But I just do you think that the establishment Democratic Party is affected by this sort of thing? Because I just don't see it.
I think it's. I don't think it's systemic. I think it is affected by it insofar as elements that support the Democratic Party and put pressure on it are trying to push it in that direction. And I do see the danger that it might be eventually pushed in that direction and land up in that very bad place. I'm not saying it's inevitable. I have faith in people like you who support the Democrats to, stave off that threat and keep everything pure in that sense. But I am scared that the increased crazed polarization in the US, where rational discussion is becoming ever more difficult, might make it all the more likely that crazy positions like that, but they're not exactly crazy, they're actually immoral and politically suspect, might actually win out on one side or the other. And I think the Democratic Party is more in danger of that than the Republicans. But so I do see, because you can't just ignore that force that is pushing on the Democratic Party's door. But yeah, I accept what you say, that the institutional Democratic Party is not yet captured by that. And as you mentioned, Biden actually came out strong for Israel. And I was very surprised by that, because I was under the impression that he couldn't gather a coherent thought in his head for long or read off a teleprompter. But then it seemed he could for that thing. So he seems to be very invested in that.
And do you remember when you said a second ago that, of course, there's a neo-Nazi right? There is such a thing as, there is. And it's a big problem in the United States. Trump met with Nick Fuentes? I mean, this is just a neo-Nazi podcaster. He's an unapologetic neo-Nazi.
Yes.
I mean, can you imagine for a second if Kamala Harris had met with Nick Fuentes? I mean, I think it would be a bigger star in your galaxy. I think it would be a bigger blip on your radar, because I just think that and your critiques of the left on anti-Semitism are certainly well-founded, and I agree with many of them. But I think that aren't you more alarmed by the fact that Trump would meet with this guy? I mean, doesn't that kind of disgust you? I mean, it seems alarming to me. And Trump's just such a strange quantity. I just think he's you never know to what extent his behavior is trolling. But I think one thing we've learned in America over the past few years is that this idea that you should take Trump seriously but not literally, that's something his defenders like to say, is just dangerous nonsense. His second term is much more frightening than his first. He's getting rid of every responsible person in the room. He's getting rid of, there's not going to be a Mark Milley. There's not going to be, the same like constraints on. There's not going to be a Pence. There's going to be a Vance. And a Vance is much worse than a Pence when it comes to defending the Constitution. So anyway, yeah, I leave you with the Fuentes point, though.
Yes, of course. I will not dodge the question. Of course it's alarming that he met Nick Fuentes. And what was it? It was with that gay guy, was it?
I don't know.
I think he also met Kanye West, didn't he?
Yeah, Kanye. Yeah, absolutely. He was
Milo Yiannopoulos.
Yeah, Milo Yiannopoulos. Yeah,
exactly. All of that is highly concerning.
Yeah.
But I would say that if Trump takes any of their advice or starts collaborating with them in a serious way when he gets into power, if he gets into power, of course, I'll be against that with fire and fury.
Yeah.
But I do also think that, obviously, I mean, nobody.
Well, I know that's what you would say. But it's just
I spit on that,
and I don't bring it up to sort of like try to catch you out.
Obviously not.
But,
no, there's no danger that I think that. No, you're just trying to get me to be balanced.
Well, no, it's not even you. I just think that there's a general reluctance to see the same, like there are a lot of people on the right. There's a sort of National Review crowd. Like there's this guy named Rich Lowry who writes for National Review. He wrote a book called The Case for Nationalism. Really smart guy, just a conservative intellectual, he soft pedals this stuff on Trump's side, because he's concerned about anti-Semitism on the left, and he calls it out, and he calls it out effectively. But then there's this, Trump gets this pass, I mean, this is something that had Biden done it, had Biden met with Nick Fuentes, like in the aftermath of October 7th, it just would have been front page news around the world. It would have been a total horror show. So I just wonder why that distinction exists, especially considering the fact that historically, right-wing anti-Semitism is more destructive than left-wing anti-Semitism. Although left-wing anti-Semitism certainly has its place. I mean, certainly in Russia and elsewhere, but just...
I understand. But I think it's an encouraging thought, perhaps, to think that a politician, such as Trump or any politician, can meet with whomever they want. And my expectation would be that, for example, if I were Trump, I wouldn't necessarily have a problem with meeting Nick Fuentes, but I don't think Nick Fuentes would enjoy meeting me, because I would be arguing against him and telling him that he's full of crap.
But how's it even worth his time? I mean, what's to be gained?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and it shouldn't be worth his time in that sense. But if I ever met him, I would tell him to go to hell in so many terms. But I'd argue it, Yeah. But in that sense, I do hope that whatever Trump discussed with Nick Fuentes and so on, that he disregards whatever they said, because that's also a possibility. Because Trump is a great independent man in a certain sense. He can easily disregard what people tell him. In fact, he's notorious for it. And in that sense, he does what he wants. So I think the proof is in the pudding still. So what will he do if he gets into power? We'll see. If he does anything like Nick Fuentes would advise, I'm against him just like you in the same kind of furious degree. But we'll see. But I do have this idea that what is more important is what people, not who people talk to, but what they actually do and say and actually promote. So giving Trump the benefit of the doubt, yeah, I am. But I'm also giving Kamala Harris the benefit of the doubt. Because I think there is a danger that Kamala might get pushed in the radical left direction, but the same thing with Trump, that he might get pushed in the radical right direction. I'm just saying that, because just as you would point out that Trump is meeting these people, because you are on the left, but I'm on the left as well, but I have more of a problem with Kamala Harris, I point out the opposite. So I don't think that's necessarily imbalanced if we bring it up, both of us here at the table.
Well,
I think that provides good balance.
I will say, just as a more general point, since we're on the election itself, and we're on Trump. So you say you care about what people say. I mean, what Trump is saying is that he will gut federal agencies, install his own lackeys. He's saying that he will use the Department of Justice as a personal score-settling machine. He says he will prosecute his political opponents. He will not accept the results of the election. He won't accept the results of any election he loses. His campaign's already filing lawsuits across the country, trying to muddy the waters and slow down the process. The only reason they're doing this is to introduce doubt about the result. Trump has, on countless occasions, revealed that he is an authoritarian in waiting. He has said this explicitly. These are core planks of his platform now. I mean, when he stands up in front of CPAC and says, I am your retribution. This is going to be that sort of presidency. Like he wants that sort of presidency. We've never had a presidency like this before. He was bad in his first term, but he was also heavily constrained. And now he's older, he's crazier, and he's more authoritarian. And he's telling us what he'll do. So in this context, like your concerns about Kamala Harris on a policy level, or in a broad sense, what's the left doing? What kind of influence is the left going to have on her? They're well taken, I mean, I've worried about these things in the past, but at the same time, now to me, I just feel like we have the most clear and present danger facing us in the form of Trump. We have to get past Trumpism. I mean, this is why November is. I mean, really, it's a joke in America. Everyone always says it's the most important election of our lifetimes. Every editorial writer, this is. It undoubtedly is. Like in my lifetime, anyway. So.
But wasn't the 2016 one also the same? The same people were saying the exact same thing.
I know, but that probably was, and now this one superseded it. That's what I genuinely think. Maybe. I mean, just anything where Trump has been involved. Yeah, I do, because I do think he's a fundamental norm violator. I think he's the fact that he's calling into question the basic guardrails of democracy. I mean, he said at one point, literally, verbatim, election fraud on this scale, and he's referring to 2020, means we should be able to suspend the Constitution. We should be able to suspend all laws, the Constitution, just forget about it. And I don't know if you saw the Supreme Court ruling, which basically grants any official act broad immunity from prosecution. This is music to Trump's ears. I mean, after the Supreme Court issued this ruling, Trump posted, "This is a great idea. I love it." Well, that's what an autocrat would say. So I just like, I'm just really, we're not in the normal realm of politics now. We've moved into a different realm where fundamental things are in question.
I see the point. And of course, the things you say Trump said and the things he said he will do, I reject those, of course. Not accepting the election result and, the suspension of the Constitution, that's terrible. On the point of immunity for political decisions made in office, I actually think that's a good thing, because I look back at the episode with Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Well, that was precisely it, because they wanted to hold him liable for what he did, but he had political immunity, which meant so long as he was in office in Gaul as a commander, general of the armies, they couldn't, as far as I understand it, they couldn't prosecute him. But he was going to end his term at a certain time, and then they were going to go for him. So what did Caesar do? He tried to stay in office so they couldn't prosecute him. And that's why he crossed the Rubicon, because he wouldn't allow his enemies to get him when he was out of office. So,
well, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly. So I believe that if you actually threaten politicians with the criminal prosecution that might result if they get out of office because of things they did in office, they might try to just stay in office. And that might embolden the authoritarian instinct in Trump all the more. I also think there is a problem of turning political issues, which in a democracy, or whatever claims to be a democracy, can always be redone. You decide something, and then 10 years later you rectify the mistake if you feel it has been a mistake. So you have the right to make mistakes. That's fundamental liberty of democratic society. That if you turn these political issues, which should be decided by popular vote and majorities, into a judicial issue, you are depoliticizing the entire thing. And that will make people think even more that they don't really have any power, because even if I vote for him, the Supreme Court might say that was unconstitutional, we can't do it, or things like that. This is a problem you have in Europe, where certain subjects are taken out of the democratic arena and made subject to human rights courts or international agreements and things like that. The EU is a particular example of that. However, exactly, I absolutely share your concerns about that, about what Trump says and so on. I would also say that once we accept that I accept what you say about Trump, with the Democratic Party, it's not only that Kamala Harris is being pressured by the radical left, it's also Kamala Harris herself. Because I was recently at a debate in Switzerland about Kamala Harris and the elections and Trump. And there on the panel, it was said that Kamala Harris is a pragmatist. Now, if you want my honest opinion about Kamala Harris, she is not a pragmatist. She's not very intelligent. She is pretty vacuous. She doesn't really stand for anything. A pragmatist, what is that? A pragmatist is Frank Underwood in House of Cards. A pragmatist is Henry Kissinger, really knowledgeable about the thing he's being pragmatic about, knowing all the interests and how to negotiate and balance interests and create a balance of power and give the other party what they want while getting what you want. Really complex stuff. I don't think Kamala Harris can do any of that. So she's not a pragmatist in the same sense that she failed upwards. She has actually been a failure politically, and nonetheless she's now the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. Failing upwards is not pragmatic.
Why do you think she's been a failure?
Well, as far as I understand it, she dropped out of the Democratic race when Joe Biden got nominated for it.
Yeah, but she's a senator.
She is a senator, but as far as I understand it, democratic processes mean that you would have to
And she became Attorney General of California.
Yes, but as far as I understand it, her presidential nomination, to be nominated as the running person for the presidency, did not follow normal procedures. She was appointed to the position. And that is not the normal case, I think.
Well, I mean,
that's just a technical point, but I think
it's not normal, no. But nobody has a gun to Biden's head. No one says you have to stay in. If he chooses to resign, somebody has to replace him. And if enough support comes behind a candidate, then normal political mechanisms kick in. And people say, Gavin Newsom says, I'm not going to run because there's no reason to, because there's a lot of momentum behind Kamala Harris. I mean, the second Biden said, I want her to be my successor, it made it much more difficult to do it any other way. I don't see that as a coup. I don't see it as sinister.
I understand, but perhaps to give a bit of context here, it wasn't just that they didn't follow normal democratic procedure. There are also rumors. I would call them rumors, but I would say that they have some weight of truth behind them, that the Democratic Party did not acknowledge that Joe Biden was becoming ever more senile, and a lot of people said, no, he's just fine mentally. In fact, he's never been better, which was obviously not true, right? And then some might say that this was not engineered, but was done cynically post-haste, that since Biden, after his debate with Trump, was unmasked as a babbling, what would you say, a drooling mess, that Kamala Harris as a replacement would somehow be fine. But there's also a question why they chose Kamala Harris, I'm not sure. But you see the point here, right? It's that, struggling to formulate this, that Kamala Harris, who was vice president and not really an entity that was really known, was chosen as a replacement for Biden in such a short space of time when Biden's authority started to crumble, seems like something very fishy going on, in the sense that she might not be actually in charge in the same way that Biden was. Now, I'm not formulating that right, but you know the arguments I'm making.
Yeah, I encounter them frequently. I mean, this is definitely a common Republican talking point at this point.
Talking point.
No, not to. It's just true that this is something frequently said. Okay,
I'm
on
not
the
an
right,
expert on this.
and it's not. This is like it's something. The idea that she didn't come by it rightfully. The idea that there's something anti-democratic going on. I just think it's very, very rich because you aren't a Trump. Well, I don't know if you're a Trump supporter, but you can't really be. I mean, but yeah, it's. These people are supporting a guy who literally tried to overthrow an election. I mean, the extent of, everyone says January 6th was the great apex of this effort. Well, it was actually much worse than that. I mean, I thought the effort to send fake electors to Washington to decertify and recertify the election in Trump's favor, his pressure that he exerted on Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, where he said, I just need 11,780 votes. These are the votes you have to find for me. All the lawsuits, everything that led up to it, that's all just like that is anti-democratic. That's purely anti-democratic. You know, I mean, this is so Kamala Harris, getting appointed by Biden at the last hour, and something that's obviously there just wasn't. I think calculations were made. We don't have time to run a bruising primary. This will leave people out in the lurch. This is it's gonna mess up the candidate. They're gonna get hurt by this process. So I think there are a lot of people like Pelosi, I'm sure, wanted Kamala to be selected. I'm sure a lot of power brokers in the Democrat, and this is how parties have always operated. Parties, I mean, it used to look at you can look at American elections going back to time immemorial, and it used to be that party functionaries could construct guardrails that would prevent crazy people, even popular crazy people like Henry Ford, for example, from really ascending to a position of real authority. It's just that's broken down, and Trump broke that system. And Trump, like this, something Trump did in 2015 and 2016, it's unheard of. I mean, in the United States, in American political history, he took an established party as an outsider, completely reshaped it in his image, and then held on to power for 4 years initially, and now he's still the dominant force almost 10 years later.
Yes, but
this is unbelievable.
I get your point, but maybe because I mangled the point earlier, what I was trying to say distilled is, for instance, Trump, he is the Republican nominee because he's actually popular in the ranks, whereas based on Kamala Harris's history, she doesn't seem to be very popular, and nonetheless they appointed her, which seems to me, again, to be fishy, because as far as I understand democracy, the person who should be running for president should be the most popular amongst those who are in that camp. But that's just my little quibble. But that's just my little quibble there. But let's get to more fundamental issues, I think, because we can argue endlessly about this, and I think you know much more about this than me, and actually I agree with you about what Trump does and everything. So, Kamala Harris is a concern for me because I know she doesn't have a problem with big tech censorship or any kind of other censorship. I know she has no problem with woke or trans. So those are the kind of authoritarian issues I'm concerned about with Harris. And I think those two things, Trump and Harris, weigh equally. But I do think the proof is in the pudding.
I guess that's the core disagreement that we have. I just don't think they weigh equally. I don't even think they come close to weighing equally, because I mean this was Vance's argument, like on the debate stage with Walz, when the issue of, like, they said, you ask Vance directly, did Donald Trump lose in 2020? He will not answer the question. He will say big tech censorship. What about big tech censorship? Is Kamala Harris okay with big tech censorship? I'm sorry, that compared to a sitting president trying to overthrow the results of an election is an absolutely marginal issue. I just do not care. Like, I mean, I care in general. Some of the Twitter files, like revelations, were a little alarming. I think it would be interesting if we had an X-Files, if we looked at, how Elon Musk makes content moderation decisions. But yeah, I just think that all the things that I listed earlier, I don't need to beat a dead horse. Trump, it poses the bigger threat. And something you said earlier when you were talking about Caesar, and it's an interesting idea, like the idea of presidential immunity maybe preventing him from being as crazy as he might be when it comes to staying in office. Because I think Trump will, if he still has any faculties remaining, 82-year-old Trump at the end of his term, I think he'll try to stay. He'll say they stole a term from me. He's always said this, that he needs to stay longer than 2 terms. So that's true, maybe. But there's the obvious moral hazard there, which is that if he thinks he won't get prosecuted, he will do horrible things. And that's the big concern. He's always said, my supporters will still support me even if I shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue. I mean, do you think if Trump literally did, with all the cameras rolling, shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue, do you think that should be protected as a presidential act? I mean, he could say that that's a deep state, or I just killed. This is somebody trying to frustrate my ambitions as president. You could construe it as an official act. But anyway, so yeah, I keep dragging it back to Trump's authoritarianism just because the election is less than 2 weeks away. And I share some of your concerns about the left. I mean, my book about Hitchens was called How Hitchens Can Save the Left. It was directed at the left. I've always felt like I have more to say about the problems on the left. But currently, I'm pretty obsessed with the Trump problem.
Absolutely. Explain why the left needs saving.
Yeah, so in that book, there were just a few core points. I don't like identity politics. I think it abandons the universalism of the left, which I think is a wonderful tradition. I do think that, especially among future power brokers and future elites in the United States, there is this tolerance for censorship, and there's a tolerance for just general anti-free expression beliefs and behaviors that I think is alarming. Hitchens was great on these points, which is why I used him as the sort of vector to make this argument. I also think that there is a left-wing argument to be made for a robust American presence in the world. This is where people just kind of look at me, askance, or they look at me with incredulity. But I mean, I think that the United States preventing genocide in Bosnia was something that could be defended from the left. And Hitchens, who's on the left at the time, made the case that NATO should be involved for that reason. This is just that if you care about universal human rights, if you care about the value of human life everywhere, which the left claims to do, it's always claimed to be a transnational, cross-border movement. You know, there are elements of the left that are more parochial, but you know, this was the whole core of socialism, international socialism. And the song was the International. So I think that you could say that like some of the things the United States is capable of doing in the world and has done are actually even radical. You know, like there was a radical reconception of state sovereignty in the 90s that said we should defend people when they're under threat. You know, even Kofi Annan, like in 1999 and 2000, was saying like state sovereignty will be the big issue in the 21st century. Like how much state sovereignty should there be? Should we have? And I know that you have very strong feelings about sovereignty, but anyway. So these are just some of the broad outlines. Like and on the left, what you'll get is Kosovo, Bosnia, that was imperialism. Everything the United States, you know, is attacked on September 11th. The Taliban harbors the organization that does it. The United States defends itself and unseats the Taliban and pursues Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. That's imperialism, according to many on the left. And I've always had no patience for that argument. It's just utter and complete nonsense. You know, the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. The United States forms a coalition, expels Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. Imperialism. It's imperialism yet again. Well, I mean, how about Saddam invading Kuwait? How about that as a form of imperialism? You know, so yeah, some broad strokes criticisms of the left, but
yeah. On the other hand, I mean, there is a kind of American empire. I mean, you are entrenched in many parts of the world. You have ships in the South China Sea, as far as I'm aware. What are you doing there? But on the other hand, if you withdraw from there and say no more imperialism, that in itself will be an imperialistic move, and the power vacuum will be filled, and that might be your fault. So it's a very difficult situation.
I do think you could call it some form of imperialism. I'm not, you know, that's probably fair. I mean, and I can understand the resentment that many people have around the world toward the United States. I do think that there is just a point at which, yeah.
Especially because you guard your sovereignty very jealously, while you expect others to give it up or don't really care about it, which is, I think, a very big truth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also true that the United States will wax poetic about the value of international law, but then it won't submit itself to the International Criminal Court, and it won't, like, the idea of sending an American statesman to The Hague is just inconceivable, you know.
Or the invasion of the
and I think
the
invasion of Iraq was also, you know, it was something that we tried to put an international law gloss on it and said it was justified by earlier resolutions. It was not justified. It needed a Security Council authorization, which it did not receive. And I thought that did a lot of harm to the whole idea of international law. It was really getting stronger throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. That's one theme of the Hitchens book, is just that I think Hitchens was wrong about the Iraq War because it did set back the project of building a coherent system of international law. So, I mean, it's got to be consistent. Law has to be consistent. And the United States can't just bully other countries into submitting to the rule of law when we want and then not doing so when we don't want. And so I don't want to sound like some jingoistic supporter of, but I will say that there is a big difference between old imperialism, between the British Empire, you know, the British in India, and the United States having a base in Japan. I think these are different phenomena. Japan is a self-governing country. Japan could kick us out. Taiwan could kick us out. Are they going to? No, I don't think so. Germany could kick us out. We're not going to invade Germany. You know, we might exert some kind of pressure if they tried to. I mean, Trump actually wanted to remove troops from Germany as a way to spite Angela Merkel, as a way to, you know, poke her in the eye. I just think this is a different phenomenon. It's not the Roman Empire when all these countries, these democratically elected countries, could kick us out, and they don't. Because Japan doesn't want American troops to be South Korea. Like, you don't want China to be the regional, I mean, China is the regional hegemon, but you don't want it to be a completely overpowered 800-pound gorilla sort of regional hegemon. So I think that there are distinctions between the American empire, such as it is, and former empires.
I think so, definitely. Which in part has to do with the rise of liberalism and capitalism, and the thing we talked at the beginning, namely that there is a more, which is why I disagree with Mearsheimer that moral progress isn't possible. But on the point of moral progress, I mean, you're a big believer in Singer, Peter Singer, who also believes in moral progress and that it happened. And I think those points are undeniable. And I think the American empire these days, or America itself, the US is actually a very good force in the world since the revolution in 1776. And I think it can still be a shining city on the hill, if you like. And to work together with that as a country in Europe, in good faith, is a good thing. We just wish you weren't so arrogant sometimes. Well,
Fair point, you know? I mean, as the American sitting here in Switzerland, I'm happy to... I actually had a conversation with a guy, an Indian podcaster, a while back, and he expressed some very deep reservations about American involvement around the world. And I don't know, I feel like I feel humbled by that sort of conversation because I am American, and I actually do write quite a bit about foreign policy, and I write about how American foreign policy isn't the malign force that it's often made out to be. So I do think it's important for Americans to put themselves in the shoes of people in other countries, and there is something like it's got to be truly crazy making about America's like constant appeals to international law and these things when we just have such a long history. I mean, from Vietnam to Iraq to a lot of other very ugly episodes of just not behaving like a country that values. I mean, our record in Central and South America is truly abysmal, you know. I mean, it's just in many cases, you know, when you look at Kissinger and Allende saying, I don't see any reason, like Kissinger said, I don't see any reason why we have to sit back and let a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. Due to the irresponsibility of its own people. That's called democracy. Like, it's just, so I totally get that. And I've read enough Chomsky. I know the view on the other side. I'm actually in the process of reading a book right now called The Myth of American Idealism, which is by Chomsky and Nathan Robinson. And I'm going to review it. Probably going to be a negative review, if I'm being perfectly honest. But, you know, it's just like some of the things that they say about the cynicism of American policymakers is just undeniable. So, you know, it's a complex, big country with a big role in the world. So, yeah, it's gonna mess up.
Yeah, well, as I would say, the irresponsibility of a foreign people isn't the responsibility of the American people.
No, it's not. No, it's not. I agree. Unless we're talking about, yeah, the irresponsibility of a foreign people.
Unless.
Well, let's say, I mean, you know, there are just cases in which I could see a democratic result leading to something like Hitler, which is what happened, you know, and...
I disagree, it didn't happen like that. But Hitler was not democratically elected, but let's say something like that.
Well, okay. If you're not going to, I mean, I do think, I mean, the way Hitler actually rose to power, I mean, especially like fusing the role of chancellor and doing the things that he did, okay, you could say that that's like he was messing with the works, but did the National Socialist Party gain a huge share of votes in, I think, 32? I mean, much, much more than it had earlier in earlier elections? Yes, it did. And it did have a lot of popular support. Maybe not the critical mass of popular support for it to have been a completely pure process beginning to end. But, I mean, there was an element of democracy that certainly fed into the Nazis gaining power. They had a base of support, you know. And what I'm saying is, look at where it led, you know. So...
Well, yeah, but, I mean, Hamas being elected by Gazans might be a better example. But I think that... but again, then no elections anymore. But on Hitler, as far as I understand it, he won an election where he lost seats in comparison to the previous election, and he was a bit suicidal. Then another election happened, and he won that one. But again, not a critical mass as far as I understand it. They never won a critical mass in parliament, that majority which is needed to control things. But also, that election he actually won, well, before the election, he banned opposition leaders, oppositional press, opposition parties, and then he won the election. I can win an election too if I have those kinds of powers and suspend democracy.
I think they had a good showing before the Nazi Party had banned. It was once the Nazi Party had won, not won, but won something 200 some seats in the Reichstag. I can't remember exactly what the number was, but it was a solid vote, and I think that was in 32. And it wasn't until after that they started just banning parties. I mean, at that point, it was still more conventional politics, as far as I remember.
Well, I'm not sure on the history, but I think if people check it out, it will be the fact that the election that he won, quote unquote, was the one where in the preceding weeks or something to the election, he banned his opposition and its press and so on.
But yeah, we can make it simple. I mean, you can use...
That is not a democratic election.
Perhaps, it wasn't a democratic election in the same way that, you know, Trump getting elected in 2016 was a democratic election. Like, it's, you know, that's fine to say, but, you know, it was certainly democratic in a way that, you know, the rise of Xi Jinping was not. Like, it was more democratic than that.
Well, different things, but...
Almost certainly. I mean, but let's take the Hamas example. Hamas was legitimately elected, or to the extent that you can say that, in 2006.
Yeah.
And if Hamas gets elected and then attacks Israel, I think Israel has every right to remove Hamas.
And
this is what I'm saying.
America has
This
every
is, But
right.
this is due to the irresponsibility of the people who elected Hamas. I mean, I'm sorry. You invited a world of pain by electing these people.
Yes, but
Like,
also
this is
if
the
they get
argument.
elected and do what they did on 7th of October, not only has Israel a right to attack Hamas, the US has a right or duty to help them, as you were pointing out, maybe.
To
To
help
support,
Israel.
in some sense, military or financial.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm glad we do.
Exactly.
I am glad we do. I'm not an advocate of cutting off funding to Israel.
So I think you're a moral imperialist, in short.
That's fine. Yeah, whatever. I'll just own it.
Well, yes. Well, thank you, Matt, for the great discussion, and thanks for having a drink as well.
Yeah, man. Thanks. I appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
Very insightful.
Yeah. Thank you. We're out of here.
Good.